Grace had always been the quiet one in the house. She was a maid, but more than that, she was the unseen hand that kept everything in order. Every morning, before the sun even rose, she was already awake, sweeping the marble floors, polishing the silver dishes, and preparing breakfast for the family she worked for. She did all this while humming softly to herself, a tune she remembered from her childhood. She was not from the city. Grace had come from a small village far away, leaving behind her younger brother who depended on her. Her father had died years ago, and her mother worked in the fields, but the income was never enough. Grace decided to leave her home and take work in the big city so she could send money back. It was the only way her little brother could stay in school. The mansion where she worked belonged to Mr. Richard, a billionaire who was always busy with his business empire. He rarely noticed the workers who served in his house. To him, everything was about meetings, investments, and deals. But Grace noticed everything. She noticed how the flowers needed more water, how the baby's blanket was always slipping off at night, and how the cooks sometimes forgot to add less salt in the soup. She fixed things quietly without being asked. The most important part of her day was the baby. The little boy, only 1 year old, was full of energy. His cries could echo through the large mansion, making the maids panic. But Grace had a gift. She could pick him up, hold him close to her chest, and he would calm down. Sometimes she would sing him to sleep in her soft voice. The baby trusted her, and in some ways, she loved him as if he were her own. But Grace's room in the mansion was small and plain. It had no proper bed, just a thin mat in the corner. She never complained, though. She was used to simple living. At night, when the baby was restless, she would carry him to her room so the family could sleep peacefully. She would spread an old blanket on the cold floor and hold the child close, rocking him until both of them fell asleep. One night, after a long day of work, the baby refused to sleep. Grace tried walking with him in the hallway, tried singing him songs, but he only cried louder. Finally, she gave up and carried him into her little room. She lay down on the floor with him against her chest. The baby's small fingers clutched at her shirt as he finally drifted into peaceful sleep. Grace sighed, her body aching from the hard floor, but her heart was calm. To her, the baby's comfort mattered more than her own. Slowly, her eyes closed, and she drifted into sleep beside him. Grace woke up earlier than usual that morning. She sat on the edge of her new bed, still amazed by its comfort. For so long she had accepted sleeping on the floor as normal, and now every night felt like a blessing. Yet she did not allow herself to get lost in the feeling. She had work to do, and she knew her life next morning in the mansion felt different, though no one could explain why. Grace went about her work as usual, sweeping the hallways and polishing the silverware. She hummed softly to herself, the same tune she always sang, while the baby crawled around nearby, laughing at her voice. She did not know that her life was about to change. Richard sat quietly at the long dining table, but he was not reading the newspaper like he usually did. Instead, he watched Grace move about the room. Her hands were gentle with the baby, her steps steady though her body was tired. He thought about their conversation in his office the day before. He thought about her brother, studying back in the village, and about her sacrifice working in silence so someone else could dream. After breakfast, Richard called for Grace again. She entered the office nervously, unsure why she was being summoned twice in 2 days. She stood with her hands folded, waiting. Richard gestured for her to sit, and this time she obeyed without hesitation. "Grace," he began, his tone calm but serious, "I owe you more than I can say. For months, I lived under the same roof as you and never truly saw you. I saw only a maid, a worker. But you have shown me something far more powerful than service. You have shown me love, sacrifice, and dignity." Grace lowered her eyes, unsure how to respond. "I cannot let that go unnoticed," Richard continued. "From today forward, you will no longer be just a maid in this house. I want you to be the baby's full-time nanny. You will be paid a proper salary, far more than before. You will also have your own private room with comfort and respect. Grace's eyes widened, and her lips trembled. Sir! I don't know what to say. Say nothing, Richard replied. You have already spoken with your actions. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. She bowed her head. Thank you, sir. This means more than you know. But Richard was not finished. He leaned forward, his voice softer now. I also want to help your brother. You told me he loves to study. From today, I will set up a scholarship for him. He will never have to worry about school fees again. He will study as far as his dreams can take him. Grace gasped. For a moment, she forgot to breathe. Her hands covered her face as tears spilled freely. She tried to speak, but no words came out. Finally, she whispered, Sir, this is too much. I don't deserve this. Richard shook his head. You deserve far more than this. You have given love without asking for anything. That is the highest kind of service, and it is rare. If anyone deserves a chance, it is you and your family. Grace fell to her knees in gratitude, but Richard quickly stood and gently helped her up. No, Grace, he said firmly. Stand tall. You are not just a servant. You are part of this home now. Word spread quickly among the staff. At first, some were surprised, even jealous, but when they thought about it, they realized Richard was right. Grace had always been the heart of the house, though she never asked for recognition. Now, she was finally being honored. That evening, Grace sat on her new bed, holding the letter that confirmed her brother's scholarship. She thought about the little boy back in the village, how his eyes had always shone when he spoke about books and learning. She imagined him opening this letter, his face breaking into the biggest smile. She cried tears of joy, whispering prayers of thanks. Meanwhile, Richard stood in the hallway, looking at the baby asleep in the crib beside her bed. The child's tiny hand still reached out, clutching Grace's finger even in sleep. Richard realized something profound. His son's earliest sense of love and safety was built not on wealth, not on luxury, but on the arms of a humble woman who had nothing yet gave everything. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the mansion began to shift. The other workers looked at Grace with new respect. They saw how the billionaire himself acknowledged her, not just with words but with actions. Even Richard's wife, who had once seen Grace only as staff, began to speak to her more kindly, realizing how much she meant to the family. One afternoon, Richard gathered the household in the garden. The staff stood nervously, unsure why they had been called. Richard held the baby in his arms, but soon the child reached for Grace, and Richard smiled as he handed him over. I want everyone here to understand something, Richard said. This house runs not because of money, but because of people. And sometimes, the greatest strength comes from those we do not notice. Grace is proof of that. She has reminded me what true love and loyalty mean. The staff clapped softly, and Grace stood blushing, still shy. But deep in her heart, she felt something she had not felt in years: pride. Not pride in herself, but pride that her sacrifices had meaning, that someone finally saw her for who she was. Months later, Grace received a letter from her brother. He wrote about how he had been accepted into a good school, how he studied with passion, and how one day he hoped to become a teacher so he could help children in their village. It is because of you, sister, he wrote. You gave up your comfort so I could dream. And now, because of the kindness of others, I can carry this dream forward. Grace read the letter over and over, her tears falling onto the page. She folded it carefully and kept it close to her heart. Richard, too, felt the change in himself. He no longer saw his wealth as the center of his world. He realized that money was only a tool, but the true measure of life was in how much kindness one could give. He began treating all his staff with more fairness, ensuring they had proper rooms, meals, and respect. His friends in the business world noticed the change in him. Some were confused, others admired him. But Richard knew it did not matter. What mattered was that he had finally opened his eyes. As for Grace, she continued her work, but now with a lighter heart. She no longer carried the baby out of duty alone, she carried him with joy, knowing she was valued, knowing her family's future was safe. One night, as she rocked the baby to sleep in the crib beside her bed, she looked at his peaceful face and smiled. She thought of how far she had come from a village girl sleeping on hard floors, to a maid unseen in a mansion, to a woman who had been recognized for her quiet strength. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "Thank you, God. Thank you for showing me that even the smallest acts of love can change the world." And outside her room, unseen, Richard paused in the hallway, hearing her words. He smiled, his heart full. The billionaire who once only saw numbers had now learned the value of a humble woman's sacrifice. What had begun with a maid sleeping on the floor with a baby had turned into something far greater, a story of kindness, dignity, and respect that would never be forgotten. As built on service, not luxury. She folded the sheets neatly, brushed her hair, and stepped out quietly to begin her day. Richard was already awake, sitting in his study with a cup of coffee. He had been thinking all night. The sight of Grace's sacrifice had changed him, and the small kindness of giving her a bed was not enough. He wanted to know more. He wanted to understand her. To him, she had become a mystery, a woman who gave so much love without asking for anything in return. At breakfast, he surprised everyone. Instead of rushing through his meal and leaving for the city, he lingered at the table. Grace moved around the room, serving as usual, but he watched her with quiet attention. The baby reached for her, giggling when she picked him up. Richard noticed how naturally she smiled at the child, how she whispered small words of comfort. She seemed to have a world inside her that no one else saw. Later that afternoon, Richard called the housekeeper. "Send Grace to my office," he said. The housekeeper looked startled. It was unusual for him to summon a maid directly, but she nodded and went. When Grace heard the message, her heart began to pound. She wondered if she had done something wrong. Had she broken a rule? Had someone complained about her? She walked slowly toward the office, her hands trembling. She knocked softly on the heavy wooden door, and when Richard's voice told her to come in, she entered with her head bowed. Richard looked up from his desk. "Sit down, Grace," he said gently. She hesitated, unused to being spoken to in that tone. "Don't be afraid. You're not in trouble," he added. She sat on the edge of the chair, nervous. He studied her for a moment. "Tell me about yourself," he said. Grace blinked in surprise. "About myself, sir? Yes. I've seen how hard you work. I've seen how much care you give to my child. But I know nothing about you. Who are you, Grace? What do you dream of? What do you carry inside your heart?" Her lips parted, but no words came out at first. No one had ever asked her such questions. She was a maid. People gave her orders, not conversations. Finally, she spoke softly. "There isn't much to tell, sir. I came here from a small village. My father passed away when I was young. My mother works in the fields. I have a younger brother. He is smarter than me. He loves books, but school costs money. I came here so I could send money back for his studies." Richard leaned forward, listening carefully. Her voice was quiet, but every word carried weight. She continued, "I don't think of comfort for myself. I think only of him. If he can study, if he can have a better life, then my sacrifices are worth it." There was silence in the room. Richard felt something stir deep in his chest. Her words were simple, but they carried more truth than any speech he had ever heard in a boardroom. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" he asked finally. Grace looked down at her hands. Because, sir, I came here to work, not to ask. Complaining would not change anything. I only try to do my duty with a full heart. That is all. Richard studied her face. There was no bitterness in her tone, no anger. Only honesty and humility. He had met leaders, politicians, and business giants who carried pride and arrogance, yet here was a woman who carried nothing but dignity, even in hardship. You've given more to this house than anyone, Richard said quietly. And yet you've asked for nothing. Grace shook her head. It is enough for me to serve. The baby, he reminds me of my brother. Caring for him gives me strength. Richard leaned back in his chair, his thoughts heavy. For years, he had measured people by what they could bring to his empire. Yet Grace, with her quiet hands and simple heart, had given more than any of them. She had given love. And love could not be bought. He wanted to say more, but he noticed her nervous eyes. He smiled instead, something he rarely did. Thank you for telling me, Grace. You may go now. Grace stood, bowed slightly, and walked out, her mind racing. She had never expected such a conversation. She wondered why the billionaire had asked about her life. She wondered if she had spoken too much. But Richard sat at his desk long after she left, unable to focus on his papers. He kept hearing her words, I don't think of comfort for myself. I think only of him. It was the voice of sacrifice, of quiet strength. That evening, Richard joined his family for dinner. The baby, as usual, reached for Grace, giggling in her arms. His wife noticed but said nothing, though Richard could see she was also grateful for the maid's devotion. Later, as Richard walked alone in the garden, he thought deeply. Grace had changed something inside him. He had begun this week as a businessman, focused on profits. Now, he was thinking about people, about humanity. He wondered how many other Graces existed in the world, unseen, unrecognized, giving silently while others took their sacrifices for granted. The stars shone brightly above, but Richard's heart was restless. He knew one thing, he could no longer ignore Grace. He had to do something not just for her, but because she had reminded him what it meant to be human. And so, silently, Richard made a decision. The next step he would take would change everything for Grace, for her brother, and for the household that had long overlooked her. Richard woke up the morning after the baby's fever with thoughts he could not shake away. The whole night he had stood silently, watching Grace care for his son with a devotion that did not belong to an employee. It belonged to a mother. He had never seen anyone care so much without being asked, without expecting anything in return. It humbled him. The baby was safe now, sleeping quietly. Grace, however, had not rested at all. Richard noticed the dark circles under her eyes at breakfast. She moved slower that morning, but she did not complain. She still served him tea, still smiled at the baby, and still hummed softly as she tidied the room. It was as if her own exhaustion did not matter. Richard found himself staring at her again, wondering how much one person could give without breaking. That same day, Richard had a meeting in the city. As he sat at the long glass table with businessmen discussing millions in contracts, his mind drifted again. He compared the greed of men in suits with the quiet sacrifice of the woman in his house. The businessmen spoke about profits and percentages, but he could only hear Grace's lullaby echoing in his mind. He realized he wanted to do something for her. The next evening, he returned earlier than usual. As he walked past the kitchen, he saw Grace sitting on a stool, eating quickly before hurrying to the baby's room. Her food was plain, just a little rice and vegetables. He stopped, watching quietly. She noticed him and stood up quickly, embarrassed, but he simply nodded and moved on. Inside, however, he felt a wave of guilt. He had dined in luxury restaurants his whole life, while the people working under his roof ate just enough to survive. Later that night, when the baby began crying again, Grace once more carried him to her small servant's room. She sat on the floor with the child in her lap, patting his back gently. Richard, unable to resist, stepped closer. He stood by the door and watched. Grace looked so tired, her body bent over, but her hands never stopped soothing the baby. Finally, after a long struggle, the child fell asleep in her arms. Richard turned away, his decision forming. He called his assistant the next morning and ordered something unusual, a comfortable bed, soft blankets, and a small crib. "Deliver them quietly," he said. "Place them in the maid's room when she is not there." His assistant raised an eyebrow but did not question him. When Grace returned to her room that evening, she stopped at the door in shock. There, against the wall, stood a brand new bed with fresh sheets. Beside it was a small crib, perfect for the baby. For a long time, she simply stood there, her hand covering her mouth. She could hardly believe what she saw. Who could have thought of her? Who would spend money for her comfort? She asked the other maids, but no one knew. They all looked just as surprised. That night, Grace sat on the edge of the bed and ran her fingers across the sheets. She had never slept on something so soft. Tears filled her eyes, but she quickly brushed them away. She was not used to receiving gifts. Still, in her heart, she whispered a quiet prayer of thanks to whoever had thought of her. Meanwhile, Richard stood at his study window, watching the lights of the mansion. He knew she must have found the bed by now. He wondered what her reaction had been. Would she smile? Would she feel cared for, even if she did not know who gave it? He felt strangely happy knowing she had one less burden on her shoulders. Over the next few days, Richard continued to watch her in silence. He noticed she walked a little lighter now, though she never boasted about the bed or crib. She simply worked the same as before, humble, quiet, giving. He realized she would never ask for anything, no matter how hard life was. That made him respect her even more. One afternoon, the baby was restless again. Grace carried him in her arms, pacing the halls. Richard followed at a distance, unseen. She whispered to the child about her village, about her little brother, about the dream she carried in her heart that he would one day finish school and have a better life. Her voice was gentle, but her words were filled with longing. Richard stopped in his tracks, stunned. Until that moment, he had never heard her speak about herself. She lived for others, not for her own comfort. That night, Richard sat alone in his room, thinking deeply. He had built his empire on the idea that success was about power, numbers, and control. But here was Grace, teaching him silently that true wealth was measured in love, sacrifice, and dignity. He thought about the baby, how he laughed most when Grace was near, how he reached for her instead of anyone else. Richard realized that Grace was not just helping the baby sleep, she was shaping his child's earliest memories of love. The next morning, Richard asked the housekeeper about Grace. "Does she ever take breaks?" he asked. The housekeeper shook her head. "She works harder than anyone. She sends most of her pay back home. She never asks for more." That answer stayed with him. He went to his office in the mansion and sat with his pen in hand. For years, he had signed deals worth millions, but now he was thinking of something different. He wondered if he could somehow give back to Grace, not as charity, but as recognition for her heart. Meanwhile, Grace continued her routine, unaware of the thoughts circling in her employer's mind. She carried the baby, cleaned the house, and smiled at everyone, even when her own body was tired. She thought of the bed and crib each night and felt grateful, though she did not know who was behind the kindness. But Richard knew. And every time he passed her in the hallway, every time he saw her rocking the baby, he felt a quiet pride. He had taken the first step, giving her a little comfort. But deep inside, he knew it was only the beginning. What she did not know was that Mr. Richard had just returned from a late business trip. The driver Richard spent the next few days moving through his usual routine, but his thoughts were not the same. Meetings, phone calls, and contracts filled his calendar, but in the quiet moments his mind returned to that late night when he had seen Grace lying on the floor with his baby. The image was like a painting that refused to fade. He could still see the way her arm cradled the child, how her body bent into discomfort so the baby could rest in comfort. He had seen many things in his life: luxury, wealth, power, but that small act of sacrifice stayed with him more deeply than anything else. He wondered why it struck him so much. Perhaps because it reminded him of something he had long buried inside his heart, the memory of his mother. She had been a simple woman, nothing like the wealthy people Richard now surrounded himself with. She had worked long hours in a small bakery to support him, and he remembered her coming home tired yet always smiling. There were nights she fell asleep on the floor beside his bed when he was sick, refusing to leave his side. He had almost forgotten those moments, but Grace's act brought them rushing back. At breakfast, Richard found himself distracted. He would look at Grace quietly as she poured tea or served food. She did everything with care, never rushing, never complaining. She always made sure the baby was comfortable before she thought of herself. When the little boy fussed, she whispered softly to him, and Richard noticed the calm in her eyes. There was something pure and selfless about her presence. During a meeting at his office, Richard caught himself staring out the window, his mind drifting again. One of his business partners noticed and asked if he was unwell. Richard quickly shook it off, but inside he knew something was changing. The deals, the profits, the endless race for more, suddenly they felt heavy, almost meaningless compared to the small act of kindness he had seen in his own house. He began to notice other details he had never paid attention to before. Grace's shoes were worn out, the solace nearly breaking. Her clothes were neat but clearly old, mended several times at the edges. He realized she often ate standing in the corner of the kitchen, quietly taking whatever leftovers were available after everyone else was served. Yet, she never looked sad. She carried herself with quiet dignity, smiling when the baby reached for her or when another maid asked for help. One evening, the baby grew restless again. Richard, who had returned earlier than usual, sat in his study with a book. He heard the baby's cries echo down the hall and, instead of calling for the nanny, he followed the sound. He found Grace rocking the child back and forth, whispering a lullaby in her soft voice. Her voice was not trained or polished, but it carried warmth and love. The baby slowly calmed, his cries turning into small hiccups before he fell asleep against her shoulder. Richard stood quietly, hidden from sight, watching. He could not understand why his heart felt heavy. Was it guilt? Was it admiration? He was not sure. But he knew one thing: Grace's devotion was more genuine than most of the things he had witnessed in the glamorous world of wealth. She asked for nothing. She expected nothing. And yet, she gave everything she had. That night, when Grace finally placed the baby in his crib and stepped out of the room, Richard went to his desk and sat in silence. He thought about his life, about how far he had come. He had everything: a mansion, cars, businesses across the globe. People bowed their heads when he entered a room. But did any of it matter when he could not even see the humanity of the people working under his roof? Grace had lived under the same roof as him for months, maybe years, and he had never truly seen her until now. In the days that followed, he began to test his own eyes. He noticed how the other staff treated Grace. Some looked down on her because she was quiet and poor. Others leaned on her, asking her for help whenever they struggled, because they knew she would never refuse. And Grace, she accepted it all without complaint, carrying the extra burden on her small shoulders. At times, Richard wanted to step in, to say something, but he remained silent. He was not ready yet. Instead, he began thinking of ways to change things quietly. He asked his assistant to order a new set of shoes in her size. He instructed the housekeeper to replace some of the old staff meals with healthier food. He even arranged for new blankets to be delivered, though he did not say for whom they were intended. Grace was surprised when she found a new pair of shoes placed outside her door. She looked around, confused, wondering who could have thought of her. She asked the other maids, but none of them knew. She assumed it must have been a mistake, but when she tried them on, they fit perfectly. For a moment, her eyes welled up, but she quickly brushed the tears away and returned to work. Richard watched all this quietly. He never told her it was him. He wanted to see how she would react. And when he saw her continue her work with the same quiet humility, wearing her new shoes without boasting, he felt something shift even more deeply in his heart. One night, the baby fell sick with a fever. The entire mansion was in panic. Doctors were called, medicines brought, but the baby cried endlessly. Grace, once again, was the one who carried him in her arms all night, wiping his forehead, singing softly, and refusing to rest. Richard stood by the door, watching her. His heart tightened as he saw her fight her own exhaustion to keep the baby calm. By dawn, the fever finally broke. The baby slept peacefully, his tiny hand clutching Grace's finger. She leaned against the chair, her eyes closing from fatigue, but her face was calm, almost glowing with relief. Richard turned away, his throat heavy with emotion. He walked back to his room and stood at the window, watching the sunrise. For the first time in years, he felt small tears sting his eyes. He realized the truth: it was not his money, his status, or his power that gave his baby peace, it was Grace. The woman he had barely noticed before was the one carrying the weight of love in the house. And for Richard, that truth was impossible to ignore. Had dropped him off, and he walked quietly into the house, tired but alert. As he passed through the hallway, he noticed a faint light coming from one of the servants' rooms. Out of curiosity, he stopped. The door was slightly open. He pushed it gently and saw something that froze him. There, on the cold floor, lay Grace, her arms wrapped around his baby. The little boy's head rested on her chest, his tiny breaths rising and falling in rhythm with hers. They looked peaceful, like a mother and child. But the detail that struck Richard most was the floor. No bed, no comfort, just a thin blanket spread out. Grace herself looked uncomfortable, but she held the baby with such tenderness, as if she would never let him go. For a moment, Richard simply stood there, watching. His usual thoughts about meetings and numbers faded. Instead, an old memory rose in his mind. He remembered his own mother, long gone now, who had once carried him the same way when he was small and sick. He remembered how she sacrificed her comfort so that he could rest. The image of Grace on the floor stirred something deep inside him. Richard closed the door silently, careful not to disturb them. He walked away, but the picture would not leave his mind. Even as he tried to sleep in his luxurious bedroom with its soft mattress and silk sheets, he kept seeing Grace and the baby. He thought about how much wealth he had, how much comfort surrounded him, yet here was someone in his house giving up her own comfort to make sure his child felt safe. The next morning, Grace woke up stiff and sore. Her back hurt from the hard floor, but she smiled as she looked at the baby still asleep in her arms. Carefully, she placed him back in his crib and went to prepare breakfast. She had no idea anyone had seen her the night before. To her, it was just another day of work, another small sacrifice. But for Richard, it was the beginning of a change. He could not stop thinking about what he saw. He asked himself questions he had never thought of before. Did his workers sleep well? Did they have enough comfort? Did they feel respected? He realized he had never cared enough to ask. But the image of Grace on the floor with his baby would not leave him. That day, Richard sat at the breakfast table while Grace served silently. He found himself studying her face. It was calm, humble, and focused. She did not know he was watching her, and she did not seek his attention. Yet she carried a dignity that struck him. The baby giggled in her arms when she lifted him, and Richard noticed how the child's eyes lit up whenever Grace was near. She was not just a maid. She was someone who gave love freely, even when she received nothing in return. As Richard left for his office, he felt a strange heaviness in his chest. He was used to closing business deals worth millions, but this silent sacrifice he had witnessed was something money could not buy. It was real, human, and pure. And though he said nothing yet, Richard knew something had shifted in his heart. That night would be remembered as the first time he truly saw Grace, not just as a servant in his house, but as a person whose actions spoke louder than words.